Yeah, I know. It's really like easy, right? Sure. Hey, good morning. I don't know if, is the microphone on? If we can begin to reassemble. I'm obviously behind where I thought I would be, so we'll need to get started as soon as we can. This check. Come on, Lauren, this one. Sounds like it's working. Good. Lauren, if you give me a signal, I'll start when you're ready. Okay. We're waiting on technology, and then we'll begin. Good to go? Excellent. This is usual for me. I always never get as far as I think I will in the first part of a presentation, so I'm going to press forward as quickly as I can, maybe faster on some slides, but I want to have time to interact with you before we get done today. So I'm saying the result of this whole global empire that puts countries, households, nations into debt is a dramatic increase in suffering for human beings, the planet as well. I'm not the only one talking about this. I want you to know that I'm not the only voice out there lifting this up. Two epidemiologists in the UK, Wilkinson and Pickett, wrote this book, The Inner Level, back in 2019, and all through the book they document increases in psychological illnesses, distress, interpersonal distress, along with a loss of conviction about creating a better society. And at the very end of the book, they say, all this is due to, quote, the almost uncontested rise of neoliberalism since the late 70s. So that more of this information is beginning to get out there, and I'm very grateful for it. So where does this suffering come from? Well, part of it, as you can well imagine, comes from economic inequality in itself, and what I call the massive material dispossession that is going on globally. I won't belabor this point too much. I think most people in this audience know something about the increasing economic inequality in the United States. It's also going on globally. I will mention this one study that came out about a year into COVID. This study was released. It was funded from all places by the Rand Corporation, which is a very large corporation in itself. And the finding of this study is that from 1975 to 2018, so we're talking from the beginning of the neoliberal phase of capitalism to 2018, $50 trillion were redistributed from the bottom 90% of wage earners in the United States to the top 10%. Of course, most of it went to the top 1%, but to the top 10%. And in my view, as a minister, a pastor, and a theologian, I think we should call this for what it is. This is the rich robbing the poor. And we need to name it for what it is. This has become so bad that the result of this, of course, is economic precarity for masses of people. And in 2022, this study noted that 62% of wage earners in the U.S. say they're living paycheck to paycheck. 62%. So they're not saving any money, can't save any money. They're living on everything they make and running out of money by the next paycheck. Astonishingly, 49% of people who make over $100,000 a year say they're living paycheck to paycheck. So what we're seeing is, the rising of prices and the hollowing out of the middle class, or what used to be the middle class. By the way, it's so bad that in the United States today, 3 white men are holding as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population of the United States. Globally, it's 13 men holding as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population of the planet. So we're not just talking about mere wealth, we're talking about wealth that exceeds even that of nation states in some instances. I mean, people are like building their own rockets and going into space, right? On their own money. Used to, only NASA could do that. Wilkinson and Pickett, in an earlier work in 2009 called The Spirit Level, studied the relationship of economic inequality to human suffering, what they called social well-being, according to these 10 criteria you see on the left side of the slide. They used those criteria and looked at the 21 wealthiest nations on the planet, and using the Gini coefficient, they said, how does inequality affect social well-being? What you see here is the result. The red line is the line of statistical significance. The further right you go, the worse the inequality. The more toward the top you go, the worse the human suffering, including, as you notice, mental illness, including drug and alcohol addictions. And the United States is right up there in the right top corner. We're the wealthiest country by GDP in the world, but we have the most suffering of any other similarly wealthy countries. So there's a lot of research on that. What I want to focus on more is what you probably hear a lot less about, and that's the cultural effects of neoliberalism on individual psychology and interpersonal relationships. Back in 1980, Margaret Thatcher gave an interview for the Sunday Times in which she said, "Economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul." I find that statement chilling. And yet, once again, Margaret Thatcher meant it as an ideal. So not long ago, in 2022, researchers in New York University and American University of Beirut got together, and they knew about this quote from Margaret Thatcher. And they said, we want to find out if it's true. Has neoliberalism actually changed hearts and souls? And not just, global economies and so on. So they decided, you have to operationalize it to research. So they decided to study one thing, and that was, have people's attitudes toward economic inequality changed since the beginning of the neoliberal revolution? And I took out a quote from the article and put it on the slide. They found indeed that they looked at 20 years of data, so a lot of data, from more than 160 countries, so this is global, and found that the dominance of neoliberalism across social and economic institutions had ingrained a widespread acceptance of income inequality across value systems in the world. So the thing is, and so what they pointed out is the neoliberalism is a religion, basically. It has many doctrines, but it's a functional religion. And one of its doctrines is individual meritocracy. So we now tend to believe that if somebody is extremely filthy rich, it's because of their innovation and brilliance and knowledge et cetera, and their hard work. And if people are not succeeding in the system, it's because they aren't brilliant, or they aren't pretty enough, or they, are lazy or whatever. And that's what has spread around the planet, but especially is focused in the core of neoliberal power, which tends to be the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe. This is the article they were citing. I'm just putting the slide up there, so if you're interested in tracing down the original research, you can. I think it is paywalled, so you would need to maybe get with a library that has a subscription to this journal. Another study I will cite, I think this is open sourced, the link is at the bottom of the slide, is appeared in the journal Psychological Bulletin, which is known here in the US as being like the most empirical of the most empirical psychology journals. This is a fascinating longitudinal study that was carried out over a period of 27 years by researchers, these two researchers in Canada. It involved 42,000 college students in the US, Britain, and Canada. And the findings is here on the page. By the way, they mean by perfectionism, not what theologians mean by perfectionism. Basically, they're talking about a compulsion to do self-improvement. And their finding is right here on the abstract, that from the 80s onward, neoliberal governance in these three countries has emphasized competitive individualism, and people have seemingly responded in kind by agitating to perfect themselves and their lifestyles. Now, they're talking about young people. One of my hypotheses, by the way, is that people who are born after 1980, especially since 1990s, are more affected by this, in terms of the psychology and interpersonal relationships, more affected by the culture of neoliberalism than those of us who are older are. And later in this same article, they mention that this has resulted in record numbers of young people succumbing to mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation than even just 10 years before. They mention loneliness here too. I should mention that in 2018, Cigna, the insurance company, hired Ipsos research firm to study loneliness in the United States. This again was a large study, about 20,000 subjects. And at the conclusion, they found that over half the people in the United States are lonely. And the amazing thing they discovered was it's directly proportional to age. The younger you are, the more likely you are to be lonely. Incredible. Scares me to death with 16-year-old twins in my house. The last study I want to mention is the opposite direction. This last study I mentioned is a sort of micro study. This one is another meta-statistical analysis. It was published in the Journal of Social Issues. And the title of this article is The Psychology of Neoliberalism and the Neoliberalism of Psychology by these four psychologists here in the US. I wish I had time to talk to you about the second half of the article, which talks about how the science of psychology is now actually been reformed to agree with neoliberal values. So we're actually conducting psychological research to confirm our own neoliberal beliefs, right? And they call, in the second part of this article, for the decolonization of psychology. It's an excellent piece. But I want to talk about the first part of the piece. They mention these four features of neoliberalism, and in the center column identify how it's affecting the psychology of individuals. So on the left top, you see radical abstraction. What they mean by that is that people are abstracting themselves. They're decontextualizing themselves from place, time, social, and material context. So when people evaluate themselves, they don't tend to consider, increasingly don't consider, their own social material resources. So they end up blaming themselves, even if they are materially dispossessed or members of minority races and so forth. The second thing they mention is entrepreneurial self. So now we're all supposed to be entrepreneurs. Wendy Brown talks about this in her works. We all become little capitals unto ourselves. I had a client, I call them patients. I don't like the term client, it's too capitalist. Patients is medical, but there's not a great term. Anyway, he came to see me about 5 years ago walked into the session and he said, "This morning I walked by a middle school playground." This is in Franklin, Tennessee. And two 12-year-old boys were getting into a fist fight. And one of them was yelling at the other, "You're stealing my brand." When you hear words like that coming out of 12-year-old mouths, you know you're living in a different time. The third thing they mention is a growth imperative, and they mean imperative. Growth is no longer an option. So if you're not growing and improving yourself, you're a loser, you're a failure. All of us are supposed to be flourishing, becoming personally fulfilled, expanding ourselves, and so forth. If you don't meet that standard, then you're a loser. The last one is particularly interesting to me, affect management. So researchers, not in the US, but around the world, are discovering that neoliberal culture shapes people such that they value high arousal positive affects. So the researchers call this HAP, H-A-P, high arousal positive affects, like excitement, optimism, being energetic, enthusiastic, and so forth. As you notice here, as an index of not only health, but what? Morality. So if you're a happy person, an energetic person, you're a good person. If you're sad or depressed, or like me, you're a melancholic personality, you're a bad person. And people do feel this way. Recently, a man, middle-aged, probably older millennial, came into my office, and he's very depressed. Been seeing me for a while, and he said, "Doc, you don't understand." He said, "I'm not just depressed. I'm depressed about being depressed." Right? And this is what he was talking about, that he felt like he was a loser, and he was blaming himself for not being able to snap out of it. In the book, I talk about the fact that neoliberal culture is not only increasing the volume of suffering in society, it's actually changing how we suffer. There's a new form of normative suffering coming on board that I call third-order suffering. Well, why do I call it that? First-order suffering, to my mind, is what we theologians call human finitude. If you prefer, you can call it existential. There's a certain amount of suffering we're just going to experience by being human beings. We all die, we're all limited in space and time, we're subject to illnesses, disabilities, and so forth. We all grieve the deaths of people we care about. It goes with being human. Second order suffering has to do with what we theologians call sin. So second order suffering is the suffering that results from what human beings do to other human beings. These are all kinds of injustices, from interpersonal to social, cultural, things like racism, sexism, all of these injustices that we know about, all the way up to war. That's second order suffering. Third order suffering cannot be collapsed into those two. It's different from them. It's certainly not given to the human condition like first order suffering is. And it's not like second order suffering. Second order suffering historically has been the result of the actions of human institutions, famously discussed by Michel Foucault. Foucault talked about the disciplinary societies, government, religious institutions, hospitals, and so forth. But as Noam Chomsky said earlier in the video we watched, neoliberalism is deconstructing institutions. It's called, what did he call it? Reducing forms of human affiliation. So third order suffering results from eliminating or weakening human forms of attachment and affiliation. So it's different. And the three elements of it are here. We have another three-legged stool. The first one is that individuals lack traditioned communities. I don't use the word traditional, traditioned communities that support them and sustain a sense of belonging in their suffering. The second thing goes with it, which is individuals are deprived of symbolic system or rituals or narratives through which to understand their suffering or by which to be comforted in their suffering. And the third element is that human beings thus feel fragmented. We're even discovering that many individuals have a weakened or even missing what we used to call internal life. They don't reflect about their own thoughts and feelings. They just react to things that are in the environment as they happen. That's a real reduction of soul, to go back to Margaret Thatcher's comment. A near elimination, I won't say the elimination, but a weakening of soul. Two qualifiers I would add quickly to this. I don't think that third order suffering is brand new, as in it has never existed before. There's a psychologist in Canada, Bruce Alexander, who talks about psychosocial dislocation. And psychosocial dislocation has always produced these three features I've described here. For example, during civilizational collapses or through colonial occupations, people will experience the 3 points that I've described here. But it's different. In those situations, historically, it exists during a time of crisis, a time of transition. What's new in neoliberalism is this kind of suffering is increasingly becoming normative. In other words, it doesn't crop up during the failures of capitalism. It gets strengthened precisely when capitalism is doing its thing and doing it efficiently. The second qualifier I put is I don't believe that third order suffering is replacing or displacing first and second order suffering. What's happened is third order suffering is growing up alongside the first two orders of suffering, and it's becoming entangled in them, so that even first and second order suffering are not looking like they used to look. Imagine, for example, a person who is grieving, who is not embedded in any community of support, okay? Therefore has or lacks no symbolic narratives for grieving or understanding grief. And they have a weakened sense of any subjective meaning. That grieving person, that's a totally different kind of grief than grief exists if you have those resources in your life. I also mentioned in the book that third order suffering is characterized by double unconsciousness. There's first of all an unconsciousness toward the internal world, which I just mentioned. People actually have less awareness of an internal life from which to live. Soren Kierkegaard, the Dutch philosopher, wrote in the middle of the 19th century a book called The Sickness Unto Death. I used to require this book in a seminar I taught on hope and despair, and after the students read it, they found themselves in despair. But Kierkegaard talked about an archaeology of despair from the surface to the depths. And he said the deepest form of despair was despair that was not aware of itself as being despair. Well, in third order suffering, I'm talking about a suffering that's not aware of itself as suffering. We're seeing a lot of patients in psychotherapy who've attempted suicide not once but multiple times. When you ask them about their suicide efforts and say something like, "You must be having a lot of difficulty," they'll look at you like, "If you insist." No, seriously. So there's just a lack of inward awareness of their own pain. The second unconsciousness, even for those who do have a residual awareness of their suffering, there's a difficulty in connecting it to the external world. So they have difficulty putting a context to their suffering and understanding why they're suffering. In other places in the book, I call this zombie suffering. So we're walking around falling apart, but we're not awake. Others have written about this using other terminologies. The psychoanalyst Christopher Bolus calls this normotic illness or normopathy. And he says in this book, which I do recommend, it's short, readable, Meaning and Melancholia. He says by the start of the 21st century, Americans and Europeans had turned away in significant numbers from introspective living. Seeking a safer and less disturbing day-to-day existence, they turned away from subjectivity. They dropped out of their minds. I saw this cartoon in the New York Times and I thought, a picture of third-order suffering. Here we have an individual living in their own solitude, the bubble, and chaos and catastrophe is going on all around them, but they're unaware of it, or they're not relating it to themselves. I'm ashamed to say that I think the dominant forms of psychotherapy in this country right now and mental health care are essentially helping people cope inside their own little inner world while being unaware of what is causing their pain. I could go on and on. There's many studies, example, the decline in empathy. This is another study of college students, 14,000 of them, showing that over time during the neoliberal age, the capacity for empathizing with others is declining. Imagine the implications of that for care. We all know about the rising drug deaths in the United States, what Ann Case and Angus Deaton call deaths of despair. This graph shows from 1980 through 2018. You can see the graph. Mortality is actually getting worse in the United States for the first time since they've been recording it. The widespread increase in suicide, according to the CDC, rose by 24% between 1999 and 2014. Suicide rate has continued to increase. Interestingly, dipped slightly during the first 2 years of COVID, and now is increasing once again. So, last point. I'm gonna get this done, Bar. I promise. And we're gonna get to talk. How might Christian ministry subvert today's empire? If you're like my students who are in Divinity School, you're all depressed by now. You know, it's like, this is awful. How can we ever climb? It's not going to be easy. I will say that. But I do think there is hope. I want to talk about just three things. Could talk about more. First, I think we should. The first two have to do with changes at the level of how we think, which affects how we feel. I think in the churches and in ministry, we need to discard and replace theologies that serve the empire. Theologies like that that were discussed by Pastor Isaac in the video, the Palestinian pastor. So top-down theologies, he mentioned in his sermon, especially those emphasizing dominion or violence, are theologies of empire. This is a painting from Duret in the late 19th century called The Triumph of Christianity Over Paganism. And you can see the top-down theology that's illustrated here. And what are the angels holding in their hands? Can you tell? Swords, right? This one may be a little more nuanced. I'll say a little more about it. I think we need to replace notions, theologies of sin as debt, and theologies of salvation as the payment of a debt. Now, you might think at first, well, Bruce, wouldn't a theology that talks about the forgiveness of debt be especially relevant during a neoliberal age where dominion is based on debt? Well, wait a minute. Theologies that are traditional in many of our churches actually don't talk about forgiveness of debt. They insist on the repayment of debt. All the way back to Anselm. All right? Anselm said, sin is debt, and he didn't talk about debt forgiveness. He said, debts must be paid. And therefore, Jesus had to die on the cross to pay for our sins. That's what he said. That's what I was taught growing up in the Baptist church, right? So this kind of theology today is reinforcing the very kind of empire we're living in. We need to be talking about debt forgiveness, not debt repayment. So I prefer theologies of sin and salvation in the Eastern Christian churches who have never talked about sin as debt and salvation as debt repayment. They talk about sin as alienation and salvation as reconciliation. It's a relational understanding of sin and salvation. This book, by the way, is pretty good, by Adam Kotsko, The Politics of Redemption. The word redemption, by the way, is a problematic word because it literally means debt repayment. So I don't like the word anymore. I think we need to use other words to talk about salvation. In an article I wrote about debt some time ago, I said this: a salvation without redemption will remain wary of a theology of sacrifice, given the justification of necessary sacrifices intrinsic to neoliberal faith. A path forward is indicated in the Hebrew Bible, which envisions a subversive God. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. These themes pervade womanist theology, which I highly recommend reading at this time in history, all the liberation theologies and womanist theology. I here quote Dolores Williams. She says in this book, Sisters in the Wilderness, Jesus then does not conquer sin through death on the cross. Rather, Jesus conquers the sin of temptation in the wilderness by resistance. By resisting the temptation to value the material over the spiritual, by resisting death, by resisting the greedy urge of monopolistic ownership. Jesus therefore conquered sin in life, not in death. So she's suggesting that we completely re-envision our understandings of the atonement and not make it rely on Jesus' death on the cross. I insert a couple of slides here to warn us that even theologies of liberation can be captured by empire. Strange but true. So this author, Ivan Petrella, is a liberation theologian in Argentina. And in this book, Beyond Liberation Theology, he says this. What he means by the way, by the dominant American liberation theologies, he's talking about liberation theologies as they are typically taught in the academies in the United States. That's what he's critiquing in this book. He says the dominant American liberation theologies and the global economy parallel each other. In both, the majority of the world's population is excluded. The bottom line is that the debilitating conditions ensure that material poverty and social liberation are never successfully placed at the forefront of theology. He's saying something similar to what I was talking about earlier. He says that liberation theology has to be firmly rooted in material dispossession. And the other kinds of social justice concerns we have include that and are involved in material dispossession. And he says in the book, this is not a theology of liberation, it's a theology of inclusion for the middle class. He also says in the book, and I like this a lot, modernity is not secular, it's idolatrous. This should give us some encouragement in the churches and in ministry. I note in my own book that I actually say in the book, secularization is a myth. I believe it's a myth. There is a Catholic theologian named Nicholas Lash in the UK who says human beings are spontaneously idolatrous. We all orient our lives around something, even if we don't call it religious, even if it's not in the form of religion. The dynamic is religious. So Petrella here says neoliberalism is theology disguised as social science. So he says the scope of liberation theology must expand beyond theology proper into the secular/idolatrous world. It shouldn't be limited. It's important to study our religious texts and doctrines, but it's important also not to only do that. He is arguing basically that if you read economics textbooks and law, political science, and sociology, you would find in them embedded theologies, embedded value systems, and that our job is to critique those and lift them up. This is a picture of Ivan Petrella, who ironically is Secretary of Culture right now in the government of Argentina. I think he did a theology degree at Harvard. Yeah, he did a master's in theology at Harvard and went on to do a Ph.D. at Harvard in law and religion. I didn't know there was a Ph.D. in law and religion. And finally, we need to reconceive Christology. Jesus belongs to the masses, not to the churches, even to Christianity. I used here for this illustration, you've seen these photos before. Some of you may have been there to Rio de Janeiro. This is the famous statue on the top of the mountain of, they call it Christ the Redeemer, unfortunately, the Redeemer. But interestingly, when they first designed this sculpture, they wanted to put an orb in one of Jesus' hands and a cross in the other. And the people said, no, we want outstretched arms, right? A second guideline is that we need to recover economics and the critique of money that lies at the core of the gospel. A good source here is Hollis Phelps. I highly recommend his book, Jesus and the Politics of Mammon. He said, Jesus' critique of mammon is not merely about our dispositions with respect to money and wealth, but rather about money and wealth as such. The disjunction between God and mammon, that is real. And if anything is to be taken literally in the Bible, this should be it. So he says in the churches and among ministers, we tend to water down Jesus' words about wealth. We won't say, well, money's not the problem, it's your attitude towards money. And that's not what Jesus says. He juxtaposes mammon and God. He's really talking about not money itself, but the mammon system, which at that time, as in ours, the money system itself was causing unequal wealth. Well, I'll read part of this quote. This is from you might not like the title of this book, but if you read what he means by communism, you'll really like it. This is, Miranda was a Mexican philosopher, mathematician, lawyer, and biblical scholar. He did all those things. He says, Jesus has no horror of wealth. He said, Jesus was not an ascetic, neither in itself nor in its use and enjoyment. What he's attacking is that some are poor and others are rich. If I may introduce a technical term, it is differentiating or relative wealth that Jesus condemns. But this he does condemn implacably, so intransigently and unexceptionally that official Western theology is too traumatized to take a really close look at the condemnation for fear the whole meaning of the Bible may depend on it. Michael Hudson, again, economist here in the United States. I don't think he's a particularly religious man. But a few years ago, he was part of a research team at Harvard to study ancient economies, particularly in Egypt and Assyria. So there were people on the team that could read cuneiform. They actually discovered that the cuneiform fragments in existence are all bookkeeping fragments. So we can actually study these old economies. Well, Michael Hudson, after being on that team, wrote this book, Get the Title and Forgive Them Their Debts. Where does that come from? The Lord's Prayer. And he chose for the picture on the front of the book, Jesus cleansing the temple. He says in the book, our epoch is strangely selective when it comes to distinguishing between what is plausibly historical and believable in the Bible and what seems merely mythic or utopian. I mean, he gives theologians hell in this book for saying that the Jubilee year, or the year of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible, was an ideal that was never practiced. He said it absolutely was practiced. The Israelites learned about this when they were in captivity in Babylon and took it back with them and reinterpreted all of Hebrew Scripture in its light. He says the economic laws of Moses and the prophets, which Jesus announced his intention to revive and fulfill, are brushed aside as anachronistic artifacts, not the moral center of Jewish and Christian Bibles. I'm going to let you hear just a little snippet of what he has to say before I move to the last point.
Economists don't talk about religion or society or anything about how to trade in a market, and theologians act as if religion's all about religion. And heaven and sex and debt is left out.
Why is that? Because if religious leaders are interested in social justice, as Jesus was, then it turns out you're going to have to talk a little bit about economics.
Well, I think part of the reason is when they translated the Bible into English, German, and the vernacular, they didn't know what many of the words meant, and so they didn't understand that most of the Bible was redacted by the returnees from the Babylonian captivity. People who came back from Babylon, and what they brought back from Babylon was this concept of a debt cancellation, andurarum, a clean slate. And the Hebrew word was duror. And in the Bible, you'll have the words for the clean slate for the Jubilee year of Leviticus 25. They didn't realize that when the word gospel was said, the good news was there's going to be a debt cancellation. They didn't realize that the 10 Commandments were very largely about debt, that one shall not covet the neighbor's wife. That means you don't make a loan to the guy so that he has to pledge his wife as a debt slave to her so that you can have your way with her.
But ordinarily that gets just translated as adultery.
Yes, adultery, but they didn't get that the vehicle for all of this was debt, that thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, mean if you're a creditor you can't swear that so-and-so owes you the money, and he didn't, that all of this had to do with the great destabilizing factor in society in the first millennium BC, which was debts beyond the ability to be paid, leading to bondage of the debtor and ultimately to forfeiture of the land to wealthy people who were beginning to group the lands all together, and as Isaiah said, plot to plot and house to house until there are no more people left in the land.
Quickly, the last point I want to make is in ministry today and in the churches, we can be subversive to the current global empire by nurturing cooperatives. There's a brand new book just out a few weeks ago by Bernard Harcourt. I think he teaches at Pennsylvania University, called Cooperation, a Political, Economic, and Social Theory. And he talks about, he creates the word cooperism. He said, cooperism operates on well-established principles of one person, one vote, equitable distribution of wealth, caring for the welfare of all stakeholders and the earth, sustainability, mutual aid, assistance, sharing, being attentive to communal well-being. And the thing I like about what he says, he points out that we don't have to invent co-ops. They are already in existence. We need more of them. He says what we need to do is compound them and network them. And this, he said, does not require forming an electoral supermajority. Basically what he's saying is that to accomplish change in the world, it's not enough to do what I'm doing up here in front of you today. We can't teach our way out of this. Instead, people have to see it in operation. So if we form co-ops, and all kinds of co-ops exist. There's farmers co-ops. Anybody here buy Land O'Lakes butter and dairy products? That's not an investor-owned company. It's a farmers co-op. They run it themselves. Anybody here member of a credit union? Credit unions are not investor-owned banks. They're member-owned co-ops. And therefore they can make their own decisions without respect to short-term profits for investors. I could go on and on. We've got lots of co-ops. I would suggest to you that churches are co-ops. Maybe not the big mega churches, but most churches are co-ops. They're basically mutual care societies, cooperatives. So we have an inroad here. Very helpfully, Harcourt talks about the work of W.B. Du Bois, who back in 1907 did a study that at the time was titled Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans. He studied black secret societies like the Underground Railroad, worker co-ops, black schools. He devoted an entire chapter to African American churches and how these worked for economic survival. And he concludes, in contrast to Marxists, Du Bois believed that classes could be leveled by means of cooperative organization. In this regard, he says, Du Bois was making a unique and nuanced intervention in socialist debates. So we need to go back and retrieve some of the older works like W.B. Du Bois and apply this to our current situations. Now we're all trying to survive. I said the margins are getting bigger, we're all being pushed out. So it's to our best interest to take the people who are being excluded and pull them back together again into cooperative endeavors. Similarly, this book by Stromquist, Claiming the City, says that in the first Gilded Age, the age I talked about earlier this morning, the most effective worker movements were based in cities. Well, cities and towns and neighborhoods are where churches are located. And he even mentions that in England, the labor movement there was infused with religious fervor by the churches in England. This can happen again, but only if we want it to. I've mentioned that healthy churches are already cooperatives. A few years ago, Noam Chomsky in an interview says it's a very atomized society. He said this earlier in the video we watched. He says this is partly due to the destruction of the labor movement, which used to offer a kind of fixed basis for many activities. By now, he says, practically the only persistent institutions are the churches. So many things are church-based. This is not from the mouth of a religious man, but he's acknowledging the value of churches as ongoing institutions and the potential they hold for social change, even today. And the final slide here for me is back to money. This is a quote from Honoré de Balzac. The final battle for Christianity, he said, will be over the money problem. And until that is solved, there can be no universal application of Christianity. And with that, I conclude, and we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. Ask easy questions.
Check. Check. But Nathan has a big voice. He'll start us off.
Parable of the sower, 30, 60, 100-fold, sounds to me more like cancer, hate, fear, conspiracy. And yet, at the end of 2023, my congregation and I rejoice that our year-end report of our endowments was exceptional. My question is this: as a pastoral theologian, how do you imagine pastoral leaders not hiding behind an ecclesial immunity, but embodying a cosmological responsibility that names these complex and complicated tensions?
I told you to ask me easy questions. So the point is, how do clergy or ministers not hide behind the need for what? The immunity to talking about these issues? I think ministers are, like everyone else, subject to peer pressure. We are. I think it's time that we all start calling each other out. Now, this will not be easy. I mean, churches, like other institutions, need money, right, to survive. And so we often depend, for example, on wealthy benefactors. And it's an unusual pastor, for example, who will go up against the wealthiest donor in his church or her church, right, their church. And yet, I think if we start preaching this kind of gospel and keep calling our people back to the words of Jesus as they exist in the Gospels, right, not as they're watered down over time, I think this can have a powerful effect upon our people, including our wealthy donors. I mean, I'm not here saying that wealthy individuals are worse than the rest of us. This is a structural problem. And I think there's lots of wealthy people who are seeing this problem and are wanting to do something about it themselves. I read an article just the other day that said that there are CEOs, they named CEOs, of U.S. corporations who want to do things that are more environmentally friendly, who want to be for less inequality, but their investors will not let them. So I think this has to be from the ground up, not from the top down. Right? This has to be a mass movement of people not just in the pews, but in the communities. There's lots of people out in the communities who might be in our pews if we were preaching a different sermon. So I think the answer, this is not an adequate answer, maybe it's a great question, but I think it has to be a ground up movement.
So our mic is not working. I'll come to you if you raise your hand, and I'll use my voice to check the question. So one of the things that you mentioned is that Christianity and churches have this long-standing power and all of those connections to various institutions within that co-op. But one of the things that's true is that people are increasingly less trusting of the church, and so the church doesn't actually have that kind of power. In my lifetime, there's definitely been this notion that the church is an obsolete piece of entertainment. So how can churches be cooperative and be co-ops within their communities if they're starting with that notion that they have more power than they actually do?
Yeah, thanks, Geneva. Geneva's one of my former students, and I'm humbled that she made her all the way from Michigan to be here. Go back to the video by Chomsky when he said that at its core, neoliberalism was dismantling human forms of association. Well, guess what? That's not just unions, it's churches. And I mentioned this in my book, that when I say secularization is a myth, the reason churches are diminishing and being weakened is not just because there are fewer believers. We've got all kinds of believers in our society. That's not the issue. The issue is that this culture is systematically distrustful of institutions, period. Not only unions, but churches, neighborhood civic groups, you name it. They're all being dismantled. So in some ways, it's the church's fault for taking these extremist positions. We see this in the news and, causing people to disaffiliate. But that's not all of it. Some of it is not the church's fault. And I think we in churches need to understand, first of all, let's get our act together. I would use the four-letter word, but probably shouldn't here in the church. Let's get our act together and not cause people to disaffiliate because of our bad behavior and bad theology. That's one. That's something we can do. But the second thing we can do is know that it's not all us that is the reason we're being weakened. So we have to find ways to form co-ops, pool our people together. And when communities see that we are collaborative and working with people and not just preaching at them, I think it changes. This is already happening in some communities around the country. I know of a church in North Carolina, a small Baptist church, that when they were about to close the doors and close the church, like many churches have closed. Well, a group of young people came in and said, please don't close the church. Let us take it over. And they did. They took over this church, which had an endowment that they were going to build, a Christian Life Center, right? Like churches, that's a new idea. They were going to build a Christian Life Center. There was like $1 or $2 million sitting over in the bank. And they got a lawyer and got things changed so that they could use this endowment not to build a Christian Life Center, but they started a debt relief fund. They renamed the church Jubilee Baptist Church, And they actually incorporated into their liturgies bringing people up from the community, not even necessarily church members, bringing people from their small town and rural community, and they would burn the debt note in front of the congregation. The church paid off their debt. You know, churches can buy up debt, by the way, for pennies on the dollar, right? You can do it. So we just need to get our heads together and do things like, you don't think people in that community know about that church? I mean, it's happening. We don't have to be in despair. We can take heart. There are things already happening. Look around. I'm sure there's things going on here in Fort Worth.
I see some hands in the front, but when you move back, hold these and then move forward.
We're supposed to stop at 11:30. You want to go 5 minutes longer? Okay, I'll stay and answer questions for, whatever. Right. Yes, I think probably a number of us in this room have seen research on the effect of social media, especially on young people. So there are actually young people in high schools committing suicide.
Can you restate the question briefly?
Oh, I'll restate the question. If I can summarize it, Karen. You were asking about the effect of social media during this neoliberal time on people. And I don't know if you said particularly young people, but people generally. Wendy Brown and other peoples are talking about this as well, that social media is very well constructed for self-promotion, right? So we all, put our profiles together very carefully. We're very cautious about our selfies and how we look and post it on our social. We're basically building a brand. Well, a brand does not have to be monetized to be important to us. It doesn't have to make money. It just has to have influence. We're becoming influencers, right? So that's very neoliberal. And it buys into this neoliberal culture I was talking about earlier. And you're right, it is increasing depression, anxiety. I talk to young people. My boys come home from school and talk about what their friends are saying. They're deathly afraid of what their peers think about them, largely because of what they say over social media or text to one another. Now, I think social media can be put to good use. The Arab Spring in Egypt was very social media based. So I'm not a Luddite. I don't think that we should just do away with all these resources. I just think we need to use them more like co-ops, right? We need to turn these uses into cooperative endeavors instead of opportunities to build our own brands. We got to turn that around. Use it for health and not. There's a hand here.
How, when you're talking about this system of higher-ups having more control over, my mind immediately goes, this is just a more complicated feudalism.
Yes.
It's more intricate, and it may have some little more nuances, but we're just basically back to feudalism.
Yes. Y'all help me remember. We're going to be a co-op. Help me to remember the name of the former finance minister of Greece, Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis. Is that how you pronounce it? He actually prefers the term, instead of neoliberalism, he calls it neo-feudalism, for the exact reason you're talking about. He says we've reproduced feudal society. The wealthy elites allow us to live on their land, basically, as long as we are servicing our debts. By the way, there's an Italian thinker, Maurizio Lazzarato. Y'all make me, I think like this, and bounce off people. Maurizio Lazzarato in Italy says that under neoliberalism, we live under what he calls infinite debt. He said in former stages of capitalism, people were supposed to pay off their debts. You know, when you took out a house loan, you had to pay that debt off. People wanted to be out of debt, whether it was a house, appliance, a car, it didn't matter. Not anymore. So if you take out a loan at a bank today, the last thing they want you to do is pay your debt off. What do they want you to do? Service your debt. They just want you to make the payments because they make a lot more money out of financing. When you buy a car, your car dealership, because of under Bill Clinton, what was that law called? It was allowed to expire. Now, I've forgotten the name of it. The law did not allow anybody but banks to do financing. That's one thing it didn't do. And Clinton allowed it to expire. So as a result of that, today, almost anything can become a financial institution, including a car dealership. So when you go buy a car, they're not selling you a car. They're selling you the financing. The last thing they want you to do is pay cash for that car. They'll do everything they can do to get you to finance that car. So car dealerships are basically banks pushing cars out the front door. They make a very low margin on the product. We've got to rethink how our whole society works. It doesn't work like we think it does.
Probably have time for one more question or comment.
And I'm suggesting these are theological issues. They're not just economic issues. Economic issues are theological issues. We're not changing hats when we do this. In the back?
Please, Dr. Williams.
You're going to ask me a New Testament question and put me on the spot. Ah. Yep.
Is that a part of your frame for resisting neoliberalism in this way, or do you intentionally avoid it because it's controversial for many Americans? So.
Both. Marx is brilliant, and I've had students, including someone I talked to recently online. He said, this is a young man. He said, Bruce, I love what you're doing. You just need to read more Marx. Right? So I'm not afraid of Marx. Karl Marx, I mean, people in the United States don't even really know who he was. You know, you mention the name Marx and they think, oh, we don't have much knowledge about this. You mention Marx and people think he was a Soviet. He wasn't. He was an Englishman, right? He was an economist. Well, I think Marx nailed capitalism. He really understood how it worked. But he understood the capitalism of his time. Industrial capitalism. Things have changed a lot since him, but I still think his work is immensely valuable. I don't think his notion of a proletariat revolution, that's probably not the best way it's going to happen today. I do believe and support labor unions. By the way, full disclosure, my father did not have a high school degree. He worked for General Electric on an assembly line for 40 years, bending sheet metal. He grew deaf in his right ear because that's where the pneumatic machine was to run bending the sheet metal. He was a member of the International Union of Electricians. Before he died, my dad started watching Fox News and got down on unions. So when I was home one day at dinner, he started doing that at the dinner table. And I put my hand on his arm and I said, Dad, If you hadn't been a member of a union, I wouldn't be where I am today, because you couldn't have afforded to help me go to college. And he looked at me and he said, "You're right." And then he told me something he never told me. He said, "That wasn't the first union I belonged to. I was a member of the United Auto Workers when I worked for Hayes Aircraft." And then he told me that his father and his grandfather before that were members of the United Mine Workers and worked in the coal mines in Appalachia. So part of why I'm into this research, it's part of my family history. I care deeply about workers. People have been pushed to the edge and, had their wealth appropriated by corporations. I got away from your question. But no, I think Marx is helpful to read, but I would say Marx plus. Marx plus some other things.
I think we'll have to leave that there for now. I want to thank Dr. Bruce Rogers-Vaughn for teaching us and laying the foundation for the rest of Ministry Week, Ministry in an Age of Empire. I imagine he'll stick around for a minute or two if you want to have a personal word with him, but please help me thank our lecturer this morning.
Thanks for being so patient with my long-windedness.